Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Navigating the COA Licensing Process, How to Prepare for Success. My name is Edward and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you're involved, so please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me anytime by sending a message using this chat panel. I'd also like to point out that Mapi Research Trust has provided handouts today, which you can access underneath the chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future streaming on xtalks.com. And now, it is my pleasure to thank Mapi Research Trust, who developed the content for today's presentation. Mapi Research Trust is a nonprofit organization that facilitates access to clinical outcome assessments for the entire scientific community. With more than 30 years of experience in the field of COAs and with the online platform eProvide, which includes databases on COAs ProColid, claims, ProLabels, and guidance, ProInsight, Mapi Research Trust is the preeminent source of information on COAs. Exclusive distributor of over 700 COAs, Mapi Research Trust is the most trusted name in the distribution of COA instruments. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's event. Yannick Michel has broad experience in clinical and post-marketing studies spanning over 20 years. She has dedicated the past 15 years to patient-centered services and direct-to-patient contact, aiming to facilitate patients' journey and experience in clinical research. In her current role within Mapi Research Trust, she is responsible for the global COA licensing client services team, including successful delivery to clients for clinical outcome assessment, distribution, and licenses, business development and strategic initiatives in collaboration with other experts through COA developers collaboration, scientific support, eCOA solutions, and linguistic validation. Julia Weissmuller has been managing COA licensing projects for a variety of pharma clients since 2016. Prior to joining the Mapi Research Trust, she spent over 13 years managing translation projects in the medical and other industries. She holds a master's in translation studies from Heidelberg University in Germany. Marie-Pierre Emery has been working in the field of COAs within Mapi Research Trust for 30 years. She currently uses her experience and her privileged relationship with numerous actors in the COA field to establish collaborative agreements with COA developers and copyright holders to further increase the dissemination and exponential use of COAs in clinical research and practice worldwide. This is for the ultimate benefit of the patients. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to hand the mic and presentation over to our first speaker, Marie-Pierre.
Thank you very much, Edward, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us today for this webinar on navigating the COA licensing process and how to prepare for success. So what you will learn during this webinar are the prerequisites surrounding the use of clinical outcome assessments, some basics of COA copyright and permission to use. We will provide keys to streamline COA licensing and will review pitfalls of COA licensing and mitigation plans. Finally, we will present some case studies, which will be followed by a question and answer session. So let's first review what are the prerequisites surrounding the use of clinical outcome assessments in clinical research. And first of all, the question is, what are clinical outcome assessments? According to the FDA definition, A clinical outcome assessment, or COA, is a measure that describes or reflects how a patient feels, functions, or survives. The FDA defined 4 types of COAs. First, patient-reported outcomes, or PROs, are completed by the patient regarding their own health status. Then observer-reported outcomes, or OPSROs, are completed by an observer of the patient, most of the time a parent or a caregiver. Then clinician-reported outcomes, or ClinROs, are completed by a clinician or any other healthcare professional based on their observation of the patient himself or herself. And finally, performance outcomes, or PERFOs, which are completed by an interviewer based on tasks that the patient is asked to perform. When are COAs used in the context of clinical research? This slide shows that COAs can nearly be used throughout the whole product life cycle, so from phase 1 to post-approval studies. Therefore, the COA licensing process to obtain the permission to use COAs in your clinical trials will need to be anticipated and potentially started very early to be finalized for the start of your study. The safe and accurate use of COAs generally involves multiple parties and roles from the COA community. Globally, there are 4 types of roles. First, the COA developers, who create and validate clinical outcome assessments and define the COA scoring and interpretation. Second, the COA copyright holders and distributors, who centralize all the necessary material to be distributed to the users, such as copies of official COA versions and translations. They also deliver COA licenses as well as guidelines for the translation and electronic implementation of the COAs. It must be noted here that COA developers are not always the COA copyright holders. For example, in the case of COAs owned by the employer of the developer, or for COAs owned by journal publishers. The third role, health authority, who provide regulatory guidance. They sometimes provide COA recommendations, and they review clinical trial study protocols. Finally, the COA users, such as physicians, academic researchers, healthcare organizations, pharmaceutical companies, and e-COA vendors. In this webinar, we are particularly going to focus on the prerequisites that should be considered for the use of COAs. This slide describes the multiple steps that will need to be followed to achieve a successful use of COAs in your clinical research. This starts with the selection of the appropriate instrument for your specific purpose. For example, by reviewing the literature and the different COAs that are available and have been used in the same indication, or evaluate your concepts of interest. Once you have selected the instrument you want to use, you will have to obtain the permission to use the COA in your project from the appropriate licensing authority and potentially pay licensing fees. If your project is international, you will need to access existing translation of the COA and possibly develop new translations, as well as migrate the instrument from paper to electronic format if you plan to use the COA in digital format. These processes will then be certified by the services provider, and once finalized, you will proceed with the regulatory submission. So before discussing the different steps of the COA licensing process, let's review some basics of COA copyright and permission of use. First of all, what is copyright? It is literally the right to copy. Copyright is the right to make copies, modify, publish, perform, display, or use in any way. It is a right which comes under the domain of intellectual property and which is governed by national copyright laws and international copyright conventions, such as the Berne Convention. Copyright exists automatically when the work is created. the copyright immediately becomes the property of the author who created the work, so the creator. Copyright starts from the time the work is created in fixed form, and its duration usually is the entire author's life, plus an additional minimum of 50 years after the author's death. It is actually 70 years in most European countries and the USA. So copyright fully applies to clinical outcome assessments since they are creations of the mind. However, the COA developer or copyright holder can sometimes decide to put the COA in the public domain. So there are globally two main categories of COAs. On the left, copyrighted COAs, which are under license, and on the right, public domain COAs, which are free to use. Generally, copyrighted COAs are accessible through the licensor with a license agreement. The material on the COA is delivered by the licensor, such as original version and translations, certificates of translation, scoring information, guidelines. Regarding COA derivatives, the licensor defines specific guidelines for translation, electronic implementation, publication, etc. And finally, any COA adaptation needs to be approved by the licensor. On the other side, public domain COAs are accessible generally without license agreement. The material is available in the literature or from the COA developer. Usually, there are no specific guidelines for translation, electronic implementation, publication, but this must be confirmed with the COA developer. And finally, COA adaptations usually do not need to be approved, but it is always preferable to first check with the developer himself or herself. So why is a COA license needed? So when a questionnaire is not in the public domain, when it is copyrighted, a license agreement generally needs to be signed. And the license agreement is the evidence that users have identified the right copyright holder and licensing authority, that they have obtained the right to use the COA in their study, that they have access to the official COA original version and validated language versions, that they have permission to develop all the needed additional material, such as new translations and electronic versions, that they have received the appropriate scoring method and interpretation guidance, and finally, that they have permission to disseminate and publish their study result in the scientific literature. It must be noted, however, that any modification of COA content and layout, for example, during the migration from paper to electronic format, cannot be done without the approval of the copyright holder. As we have seen earlier, the COA developer is not always the COA copyright holder. The COA developer is the scientist who developed the COA and hence can be the best help for the appropriate use of the instrument. The COA developer is your scientific guarantee, as he can answer any scientific questions you may have about the COA. He can advise on the appropriateness of the COA for a particular purpose. He can validate COA modifications. He can be involved in new translations and electronic implementation. And finally, he can help with scoring and interpretation of results. So it is very important to involve and interact with the COA developer when you use a COA in your projects. Now, before going deeper in the different steps of the COA licensing process, let's assess together through the following poll question, what are the biggest challenges you have experienced with COA licensing?
Thank you so much, Marie-Pierre. And with that, I will gladly go ahead and launch our poll question for today's webinar. Now, audience members who are viewing live can in fact vote on this poll in real time by clicking the answer option that best applies to them. Today, we are asking, what is the biggest challenge you have experienced with COA licensing? And the answer options that we have provided are wrong COA versions, delayed timelines, issues with identification of copyright or conditions of use. Your biggest challenge is obtaining guidelines for derivatives, COA translations, or missing documents for regulatory submission. I'll give the audience 5 to 10 seconds here to cast their final votes. Again, today we are asking, what is the biggest challenge you have experienced with COA licensing? All right, well, it looks like most of you are in fact voting here, which we do very much appreciate. I'll give everyone just 5 seconds to cast their final votes if they want to change their minds or they haven't voted yet. Okay, it looks like most of you have voted. Again, thank you so much for voting, and let's go ahead and have a look at those results. So it would appear 45% of our audience, the bulk of voting issues with identification of copyright or conditions of use as their biggest challenge that they've experienced with COA licensing. After that, 31% of the audience voted delayed timelines. 19% of the audience voted obtaining guidelines for derivatives. 3% of the audience voted wrong COA versions, and 1% of the audience voting missing documents for regulatory submission. Thank you everyone so much for voting. And with that, I'll pass it over to our speaker, Janique, for some comments on the poll.
Thank you, Edward. So definitely interesting results, and hopefully we'll address those concerns and the mitigation plans in our next slides. So let's start with digging to the COA licensing a bit more, and with a brief overview of what is a comprehensive COA management process.
Janique, so I'm terribly sorry for interrupting you. Yeah. I don't know if your webcam engaged. You may want to try it again just to double check. Yeah. Yep. Oh, is it? Oh, okay. There we are. Much better. Sorry for the interruption.
No worries at all. No worries. Sorry for that. Let me go back to this. Let's start, as I said, with a brief overview of the what is a comprehensive COA management process. So you may start with needing some strategic guidance for your objectives and endpoints with a literature review to define the most appropriate instruments for your study. You may also need some information search to identify the copyright holders, clarifying conditions of use, availability of translations, etc. The actual COA licensing process, the translation process, access to scoring guides and manuals for your analysis, and the development of electronic versions of the COAs. So now we can do a deeper dive into the licensing process itself. We can break it down into 3 main steps: collecting the needs, the actual licensing, and the COA management. So as a first step, it is really important to confirm the exact needs to get the project off to a good start. The licensing provider has to obtain the complete list of COAs and the required languages as well. They also have to check the exact source version to be used when multiple versions exist. They need to check the translations already available from the COA owners. And finally, they need to investigate on any specific requirements, such as specific process for electronic implementation, translation, or training for clinicians, for example. So once those requirements have been identified, the licensing provider needs to contact the owners of the COA to request a license. So the next step here is really to go through the legal review, the contract negotiation of the license by the signing party, unless of course it's in the public domain, as we mentioned before. It will typically involve some back and forth until consensus on the contract language has been reached. And upon signature of the license, and sometimes even upon payment of the fees, the owner of the COA will provide the official English version, any existing translations, the permission to translate if applicable, and any supporting documentation such as the scoring manual. And finally, once the license is signed, then the COA can be used for the purpose it has been licensed for example, a clinical trial. It usually triggers at this point activities for other parties involved in the COA management, meaning translations can be created, electronic version and screenshots can be sent for approval to the COA owners if required. Paper COAs can be printed and distributed to the research locations. It is very important to ensure compliance with the terms and the defined scope of the licensing. And it is in line with the requirements of the owner. For example, the number of patients, the administration method, etc. It also means that these licensing terms and any requirements need to also be communicated to all parties involved in the use of the COAs. So now let's go through the translation process and what happens if you need to translate the COAs. So you really need to keep in mind that it is usually not a simple translation process, but rather a thorough linguistic validation process. Why is that? The linguistic validation was designed to maintain the properties of the English source scale in the languages, meaning ensuring that the questionnaire is understood exactly the same way, whatever the level of education, country, and language. So I will not go into the details here of each step. However, as you see here, it does involve multiple steps from the conceptual analysis of the COA until the full certification of the COA, of the translation methodology. So your translation provider most often will need to translate COA in paper first. This process is complex, as we see here, and requires time and can take 6 to 10 weeks, depending on the COA, sometimes more. And that's why it's really important to be taken into account in your study planning. So now let's move on and look what planning and timelines look like. COA or e-COA will always be on the critical path for your study startup. So you need to keep in mind the dependencies for the study timelines. The challenge you face is that multiple services are involved and have interconnected deliverables. The most common challenges we hear from sponsors are about delay for ethics submissions or first patient in because patient-facing material was not available in time. Taking here the example of paper COA set up in a clinical trial, licensing needs to be completed before paper translation can start. The licensing timeline can usually take 4 to 6 weeks on average, but can even take up to 3 months if any difficulties are encountered to contact the COA developer, for example. So if we skip to e-COA, implementing an electronic approach will include even more stakeholders and milestone on your study startup timelines. For example, here, screenshots cannot be sent for submission until the system design is complete and copyright holder has approved them as appropriate. Migrate paper translation into e-format cannot start until screenshots have been submitted. So all of the milestones from licensing to user acceptance testing need to be clearly identified and outlined in the planning. As you can see here, there is a lot to each service era. So now let's review main pitfalls and mitigation plans. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Yannick. Hello, everyone. So we'll just look at some of the main pitfalls that you can come across in the licensing and how to best address and mitigate these. So if the licensing is not done correctly, it can have quite a significant impact on the success of your project. And on this slide, you can see some of the biggest risks associated with COA licensing. Starting from the left, if a license is not in place, this can result in the breach of intellectual property, copyright infringement, and it can even lead up to legal action. So it's quite important that even if sometimes we work under time pressure for licensing, to always remember this first risk, there's potentially legal implications. Second risk, study delays. If you've worked on licensing, you might already be aware of this, that can happen if the license is not in place. Regulatory submissions, site initiation visits, or even patient visits might not occur on time. Thirdly, protocol amendments. If the license is not in place, you might have to even remove the COA from your clinical trial protocol. And this will then mean that potentially you cannot collect all the endpoint data that you were planning to collect, and you will have to change the protocol. And finally, a risk is invalid or missing study data results as a result of using incorrect COA versions. And on this slide, you will see some of the main pitfalls in the licensing process. We've grouped them in 3 categories: COA identification, licensing and legal, and operational. So starting with COA identification, top of the list and very much in line with the results that the poll has just shown, is sometimes information for the copyright holder might not be available, might be incorrect or outdated. The information around the conditions of use can be sometimes somewhat scattered if you do not share this in a central location for future reference. The conditions of use might also differ across different scenarios. So, for instance, the paper version of a COA might have a different copyright holder from the e-COA version. And then for licensing and legal, sometimes there's just no awareness that a license is needed. There could also be some confusion around whether a specific version is copyrighted or in the public domain. It can also happen that the cost for use of the COA has not been anticipated, and therefore there is no funding available to use the COA. And operationally, we've already touched on using incorrect versions as a risk. There could be a lack of awareness that there are a lot of different teams involved in the COA management whose activities all depend on the licensing. And very often it's also not anticipated just how long it can take to get the license in place. And we have to bear in mind here that a license is a contract which comes with contract negotiations, legal review, and this process can take some time. And so now, how can we avoid these risks, avoid the pitfalls? As we've just mentioned already, there's typically quite a number of different teams or stakeholders involved in using COAs in a clinical trial. So you might have your clinical team, e-COA, data management, translation team, obviously the licensing team, and the copyright holder. And what can really help you here is creating a detailed project plan, which outlines, first of all, the overall project timelines, and then also the individual timelines, so the timelines of all the different stakeholders. When you create your plan, you will need to ask which COAs are needed, when are they needed, in which format, in which languages. And typically, if this is a clinical trial, the dates that you will work towards are regulatory submissions or site initiation visits. In your plan, you should also outline any specific risks for each of the team, any requirements they might have, and it's also really recommended to clearly define the roles and responsibilities of each team, because this will ensure that you know who is accountable for which deliverable. And this plan usually works best if it's coordinated centrally. So if there's someone overseeing the activities of the different teams, and either way, all throughout the process, as you go along, all the different teams should constantly provide updates on the status, and the status needs to be tracked so that as and when needed, you can then adjust your plan. Another important strategy is doing an in-depth analysis of the COAs upfront so that you can identify and mitigate any potential risks, assess any needs, anticipate any requirements. So when you do this, the licensing provider will look at different aspects. For example, any potential challenges in the licensing, bearing in mind the pitfalls and risks that we've just already talked about. So maybe, for example, you know that a COA developer has longer response times and you need to plan more time. They might have specific requirements, for example, around training of clinicians in the use of the COAs. You will also look at the translations. Are any translations already readily available, or do they need to be created? Are there any translations that could be challenging and therefore impact the timelines? So this happens if, for example, the COA developer requires a specific translation process, or the COAs are quite lengthy and just take longer to translate. Then you would also be looking at any difficulties around the implementation of the COAs in electronic format. Are there any requirements from the copyright holders? Do they have any specific guidance for eCOA? Or do they also want to be maybe involved in the process by reviewing screenshots? And when you do this analysis, it's always really important that you leverage any experience that you have from previous projects, any lessons learned. If you have a COA repository at your disposal with contact information for copyright holders, it can really help save time, and you will not have to reinvent the wheel for each of the projects. And yeah, so we've already also mentioned that one of the biggest issue is the use of incorrect COA versions. So on this slide, you will see some tips how you can ensure protocol compliant versions. First of all, you should always check that you have the full name of the COA, not just an acronym, because the acronyms are sometimes used, the same acronym is sometimes used for different COAs. You should also look into any subversions of your COAs and see which ones you need. So there might be a public version or a copyrighted version, a modified version, module, caregiver reported version, or patient reported version. And a tool that can really help you here to do this analysis is the clinical trial protocol. In this protocol, the sections that are really helpful are the schedule of events and assessment, and especially also the footnotes to the schedule of events. This section with bibliographic references will give you a clue on the copyright holder, and then also the section where COAs are described in great detail. The patient population is also useful information in the protocol. it will help you understand which age groups or which gender your COAs should address. And when you look in the description section in the protocol, you can pay particular attention to the number of items, so the number of questions mentioned, the mode of administration, so that would be paper versus eCOA, and also the look back period or recall period, for example, in the past months or in the past week. And when you've done all this analysis, it's always really important to verify your assumptions. So for example, if you can have access to review copies and reference this against the information in the protocol, it can really help. And sometimes you can find these review copies actually in the appendix of the protocol. And either way, you should always try to document your assumptions and have these confirmed to make sure you're using the correct versions. And with this, I would like to hand back to Janique, who will talk about some case studies.
Thank you, Julia. Okay, so if we go to the first one, so we wanted to go through a couple of practical examples of what can go wrong and some best practices. So for this first one, used in a US phase 2 trial, an incorrect version was used for the eCOA build. So the eCOA system build started with review copies that were not issued by the COA licensor. So the impact of this was that the eCOA version needed, of course, to be updated, delays in study timelines, additional cost, a CAPA, a corrective action plan, and obviously some reputation issues. The root cause was some time pressure, and also lack of communication with some subject matter expert. The corrective action needed was that full licensing, translation, screenshot reviews, and eCOA build process needed to be done again. In terms of the best practice, as Julia explained before, early co-assessment with the licensing provider is really key, and ensure the provision of review copies by the COA provider and anticipate the licensing need. So if we skip to the second example, the challenge here was for global phase 3 trial in dermatology, and the version used the COA version used did not exist. Actually, the sponsor created a new COA based on another existing one that we all know quite well, AQ5D, without getting the permission to modify it. So the impact of this was definitely a breach of copyright infringement, discovered only during the eCOA system build and the licensing process. A protocol amendment was needed and major study delays. The root cause here was that the sponsor had no specific background on copyright rules, and the corrective action was legal discussion with the licensor, needed, again, full licensing, translation, screenshot reviews, and eCOA build process to be done again. So again, here the best practice is really to perform this early COA assessment with the licensing provider in the study planning, and making sure that you include the right stakeholders. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed this presentation. Before we move on to the Q&A, we wanted to give some key takeaways and a summary of what we've discussed. The first one is ensure you seek for copyright and licensing requirements before using COAs. Also keep in mind all dependencies when building your study timelines for your COA implementation. The third one, identify and mitigate upfront any potential risks to COA or e-COA implementation, and optimize success by involving appropriate stakeholders for their individual area of expertise. So now I'm turning back over to you, Edward, and opening the floor for questions.
All right, thank you so much, Janik, for that insightful presentation. And thank you, as a matter of fact, to all of our speakers for that very informative information. I'd like to invite all of our speakers at this time to engage their webcams for the Q&A portion of the webinar. And I'd also like to invite our audience to continue sending their questions or comments right now using the questions window. And so speakers, I've already received some questions here, so let's go ahead and get started with those. This first audience member asking, can a general license be signed for COA to be used across all my studies, or is it study specific?
Okay, maybe I can take this one. So usually, I mean, the regular, the rule is typically that it is study specific, even though some copyright holders may agree to have some master agreements and agree on a volume of patients or administrations. But typically, it's rather a per project license. Any other comment from Yuka or Marie-Pierre?
No, that's perfect. So it's correct that whenever you work on a new study, you will have to get a new license, not only for the original version, but actually also for translations. You will have to relicense them again by default, even if you might have used them before. Mm-hmm.
Understood.
And that's sorry, I just wanted to say that's an important point, an important question, because that's potentially when people are reusing or intend to reuse COAs, that they may forget to sign a new license for a new project. So that's very important to realize that it's not because you have obtained a license for one project and that you have a copy of the questionnaire, for example, in your folders, etc., that you have the permission to reuse them in other studies. So take this in mind. It's very important to sign a new license or to check with the appropriate party, generally the copyright holder, the licensor, whether you have to sign a new license. So important, yes.
I see. Thank you, all of you, for clarifying. Another question for you here. This viewer asking, why is screenshot review needed? Is it only for original version or all languages?
So I can answer this one maybe. I want to start to say that screenshot review is only mandatory if the copyright holder requires it, and quite a lot of them do, especially that we see more and more studies working in e-COA. But it's always really highly recommended to do it also for the translations, because it will help you, let's say, for fonts that might be a bit more complex. It will help you identify any corrupted characters, make sure the line breaks are correct, and also ensures that a native speaker in the language can check what the patients will actually see on screen when they're using the COA. So it's a process that's always best to implement for both the original and the translated versions.
I see. Thank you for that answer, Julia. Much appreciated. Another question for our panel here. How do you determine if a COA is copyrighted or in the public domain?
Maybe I can take this one. So it's a very good question, and sometimes also a difficult question to answer. Because it's sometimes difficult to find the appropriate licensing party for a questionnaire. So of course, it's not you, the user, who will decide if a questionnaire is copyrighted or in the public domain. You first have to identify, I would say, the developer. So you will do this through the literature. So articles, the first articles on the development and validation, you will identify the author. You will contact the author to get information on the questionnaire, on the conditions of use. Normally, if the developer is not the copyright holder, which is sometimes the case, the developer will give you the contact details of the licensor, so that you contact them. You provide information about your study, and in order for you to sign the appropriate license. So it's a very important point to clearly and to correctly identify the developer, the copyright holder. And generally, the fact that a questionnaire is in the public domain is given by the developer. I mean, the developer says sometimes in the publication of development of the questionnaire that the questionnaire is in the public domain. Sometimes you will find this easily also on the internet, because the web is also a very good source for finding information on questionnaires and finding the right parties to contact. You also have platforms, databases that provide information on questionnaires, where you have centralized information about the questionnaire. So when you see on the internet that a questionnaire is published a lot, it's used a lot, it's available in different websites, you can find copies of the questionnaire on a lot of different websites on the internet, etc. You see researchers that say on the internet in publications that the questionnaire, multiple people say that the questionnaire is in the public domain. Generally, it's a good clue to think that the questionnaire is in the public domain. But we would always advise to do a kind of a search and what we call a due diligence process to really confirm who is the copyright holder of the questionnaire or not. I don't know if Julia or Janik, you want to.
All good, thank you.
Okay. Yes, perfect.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Marie-Pierre, for that insightful explanation. Greatly appreciated. And excuse me, I have another question here that may in fact tie in to the previous one. This audience member stating, sometimes it is very difficult to find the actual validated version of the COA. Is there any help from Mapi on this front?
So yes, we can absolutely help here. So we have our database eProvide that users can subscribe to. We also offer a service that we call information search. Let's say if we don't have the information available and you need help with this research, please feel free to reach out to us. But yeah, typically this process can be difficult when we don't have the information in our repository, and we would make sure in this due diligence search that was just mentioned to search the literature to find any clues about the authors, because even though it can happen that a version is available online, which as Marie-Pierre said, is a really good indication that it will likely be free to use, sometimes it's not. So we will always seek to get confirmation from the author once we've identified the author, if we do not already know the author.
I see. Excellent. Thank you, Julia, for that answer. And we're having many questions from the audience here today, which is great to see. This next one, this viewer asking, do copyright holders typically already have access to translated material to share, or do licenses need to plan for independent translation? If previous translation has occurred and been validated for use, is it noted when COAs are being considered?
Maybe I can start, and you may add anything, Marie-Pierre and Julia. So, yeah, typically when translations are already available, that will be typically available from the copyright holder, and we don't have to start from scratch again. Obviously, there can be some trial-specific versions, etc., that can be used by a specific sponsor, for example, who required a translation. But yes, definitely the copyright holder will have all of the information on the available translations to start with, and that's where we start with doing what we call a gap analysis. When we get a request for a COA and the different languages required, one of the steps that are being taken is really to do this gap analysis and see what is already available for this questionnaire. Any other comments, Marie-Pierre, Julia?
Maybe I can add that actually the copyright holder also owns any translations that were performed. They would be considered derivative works. So even if you've sponsored a translation or done a translation, the copyright holder would own them, and you should always also inform them on this, and this will be done during the licensing. But I would like to say precisely that actually you have to get the information from the copyright holder and their translation certificates, and you would not actually be allowed to create a new translation if there's already a copyrighted translation available.
Excellent, understood. Thank you both for that answer there. Another question for our panel here. How many weeks are recommended for new translations? I have had some African languages and was not sure of the expectations.
Maybe I start again. When we went through the linguistic validation slide, on average, you can keep in mind 6 to 10 weeks. That's the average. But obviously, when we may have some more rare languages, or there are some specificities, this can take sometimes a bit longer. It also depends on the translation vendor that you may use, if you do use one, but on average that's approximately 6 to 10 weeks, and this will also vary depending on any additional steps that need to be done for the translation or linguistic validation process. For example, for patient reported, you may need to add what we call a cognitive debriefing, meaning testing translation with like 5 to 10 patients or people, and same for when it's for clinicians, a clean row, then you might need to do some clinician review of the COA. So that will also add some difference with the timelines for the linguistic validation.
Understood. Thank you for clarifying that, Jenny. Much appreciated. Another question here. Perhaps we have time just for a few more. Again, I appreciate the speakers taking the time today to answer all of these questions, and to our audience, thank you so much for continuing to ask your questions. We appreciate it. This audience member asking, is linguistic validation the recommended methodology for all translations of COAs?
So maybe you, Marie-Pierre, you may add something, but I think it is the recommended approach, just because you want to make sure that, again, I mean, if you take a simple example of measuring the effort by I don't know, carrying something, depending on where you live, if you're in, where there is a lot of snow or a lot of sun or whatever, then you may give different examples, and you really want to make sure that people will understand the concept depending on where they live and what makes sense to them. So it's definitely the recommended approach. However, depending on the use. And I know, for example, we have some academic clients who might maybe go through a less detailed linguistic validation process or a more simple translation, and that's okay. Just keeping in mind again that it's really to ensure that you measure the thing depending on from one country to another. So that's the recommended approach.
Understood. Thank you again for that answer, Jenny. Much appreciated. And if I may, Marie-Pierre, I just want to mention, I think your mic is a little bit sensitive and I can hear some blowing in the background. I think it's okay, but if you don't mind muting just temporarily when yeah, sorry about that. Much appreciated. Thank you so much. Okay, another question for our panel here. I have ran into situations where one version of a questionnaire is in the public domain and another version is copyrighted. How does this work and impact a study?
Yes. So maybe this would really be in the line with the section that we touched on about the protocol compliant versions. It can happen that there is a version of a COA that is copyrighted and another version might be readily available online, either because it's been put in the public domain or because it was actually just published put online even though it's copyrighted. And here, if you are doing the licensing for someone, for another team, it really helps to have the protocol to have bibliographic references. And if you are unsure, I would always err on the side of caution and contact the owner of the copyrighted version, run your assumptions by them, say maybe, for example, you found a version online, is this free to use? And they will guide you. So I would go with contacting the authority that does require a license and check with them to make sure this is not a derivative and they don't own the public version. Mm-hmm.
Understood.
Oh,
yes.
Julia, maybe just yes, two word, additional word. It's I would say it's not really logic that one version is copyrighted and one another it's put in the public domain on the internet. So if you find a copyright holder somewhere, it's always better to contact them rather than making the assumption that because you found one version free of use or readily available on the internet, that you can reuse this version. Please never do that because you might have a lot of problems. So always try to contact someone, either the developer or the copyright holder, or Mapi, as we can also help you to identify the right contacts for the questionnaire. But you know, it's not a usual situation, you know, to have both. So it should immediately ring a bell to you. It's not logic, so that there is something to check. And I will not make the assumption that this questionnaire or this version of the questionnaire can be used without any permission or totally free. So be very careful with this.
If I may just add another quick thing, if that was verified that it's okay and you have those this version in the public domain and another one not, then just to answer the question, what happens for the study? Then the only thing to do is to make sure that the one where the copyrighted, you do have a license in place. So that's the only additional thing to make sure you do to complete the whole process.
Understood. Thank you for that additional valuable information. I'm sure it's greatly appreciated. And thank you to all of our speakers for answering that one. I realize we're getting at the top of the hour here. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question because I think it's a great one to end off on. And this viewer is asking, when should the licensing start?
So really the licensing should be one of the first thing you do, as we saw on the timelines slide. So typically, and when possible, whenever you have a protocol synopsis ready, or even a finalized protocol ideally, because that's the ideal situation, this is really the first thing you would need to do. To set up your license is really the first thing that will trigger the activities for the rest, like the translations and everything else. So that's the first step you need to do.
Understood. Great. Thank you for that simple and straightforward answer. Much appreciated. And again, thank you to all of our speakers for all the answers today and a great Q&A session. At this time, we have reached the end of the question and answer portion for this webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the speakers and the team at Mapi Research Trust will follow up with you after the webinar. So speakers, thank you again once more. I'll ask at this time that you can disengage your webcam while I just proceed with some concluding remarks for today's webinar. So thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated on that survey as it will help XTalks and Mapi Research Trust to improve the webinars. I'm about to send everybody a link in their chat box, which I have done so now. You'll be able to view the recording of this event on this link that I've sent you, and you can also share this link with your colleagues if you feel that anybody would benefit from the discussion that we had today. So I encourage everyone to do that. Again, please join us once more in thanking our wonderful panel. Marie-Pierre, Janique, and Yulia, thank you again for a wonderful webinar today. We hope you all found this webinar informative, and have a great day, everyone.